Hey gang, real quick, I wanted to let you know that tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 8 p.m. Central Standard Time, 7 p.m. Mountain Time, and 6 p.m. Pacific Time, I'm going to be interviewing Cody Fernandez, the creator of Jack Irons, the Steel Cowboy. There is an Indiegogo campaign to fund Issue 2 and physical copies of both Issue 1 and 2 for those who pledge $25 or more. Link in the description below. With that, here's my thoughts on queer theory and G.I. Joe. Hi everyone, it's your boy #1 Marmaduke fan here. I just watched Diversity in Comics video, Why Did Aubrey Sitterson's SJW take on G.I. Joe fail? Oh, you know, no reason, lol. And in it, Diversity in Comics mentions little details like how the Joe's phrase, Yo Joe, has its own big goofy red, white, and blue lettering, and some little cutesy things like Quick Kick, the psychopath, threatening to kick two big bad guys, and then the bad guys running away like they're scared. So this sort of silly Billy humor, and kind of campy, kind of cheesy, and something clicked for me that things are always clicking for me on this channel. But it reminded me of my time having to learn about queer theory in SJW art school. And the reason I haven't talked about queer theory much on this channel is that I somehow got an A+ in that class without understanding one word of the essays I was reading in queer theory. I was like forcing myself to read them and comprehend the words. I'd regurgitate in my essays, and then I'd forget everything about queer theory, and I was never really sure what the heck I had just read. And unlike feminism, where I can at least kind of wrap my head around the idea of they're talking about a patriarchy, they believe the patriarchy is oppressing women, I can kind of sum that knowledge down into a few paragraphs or a few sentences and say, okay, this is what feminist theory in art is. I'm not really sure how to parse down what queer theory in art is yet, but I do still have my, since I save everything, I still do have my collection of queer theory essays. So the thing I want to float here is that there is a decent chance that Aubrey Sitterson has been informed by queer theory, regardless of whether Aubrey Sitterson, like me, had the misfortune to sit through a queer theory in art class. And the reason I say that is that queer theory is obsessed with camp, and it sees it as something politically viable for the, what would you call it, the intersectional left, especially the queer LGBTQ dimension of the intersectional left, is very fascinated with camp culture. And I think that G.I. Joe is a reflection of this, and Thundercats is a reflection of this, where normal people look at G.I. Joe and Thundercats, and we may laugh at a few of the little, 80s goofiness in some of those shows, but we mostly appreciate them as fun fantasy adventures, all-American adventures. Thundercats, I see that as a very sincere, sweet story of a young man becoming a hero and learning responsibility. But if you're looking at it through the lens of camp as political activism, if you're looking at it through the lens of queer theory instead of just the feminist lens, now we've got the queer intersectional feminist lens on, then camp becomes a sort of political tool, a subversive tool. So my guess would be that even if Aubrey Sitterson hasn't studied queer theory, he's at least familiar with that enough so that when he sees G.I. Joe, he sees the goofiness and the silliness of G.I. Joe, not as something charming or humorous about the G.I. Joe franchise, but as an opportunity to mock the sort of American hot-blooded hoorah patriotism in a franchise like G.I. Joe. If you mock the Thundercats and focus on just like the cheesy, silly Billy weirdness of Thundercats, what you're using is a type of humor which mocks the sort of sincere, masculine, coming-of-age story of the original Thundercats. Now, since I've kind of admitted that I don't really understand what the heck the astute kind of postmodern queer theory essays were trying to communicate to me, I still think it will be important for me to try to dig into those again and make some sense of some of it. But for now, I'm just going to use a fake news piece to try to help illustrate my point. So we're looking at Slate and archive.is. I have archived Postcards from Camp by J. Brian Lauder. And in this little Slate whatever piece, he's responding to an essay by Susan Sontag Notes on Camp. Now, of all of like the SJW left-wing art stuff I had to read, Susan Sontag isn't a bad one to read. She was a very political leftist, but it actually does a pretty good job of kind of walking you through what Sontag thinks camp is and how to define it. Because think about it. What's the difference between something being cheesy, something being melodramatic, and something being camp? I would kind of hold up the Adam West Batman TV series as the perfect illustration of camp, where the cheesiness of the Batman Adam West series is deliberate. It's supposed to be part of the appeal of Adam West Batman, that it is campy. But something could be cheesy or silly unintentionally if you start out sincerely wanting to tell a beautiful story, like whoever that guy was who did The Room, and then everybody ends up laughing at it. Your intention wasn't to make a camp masterpiece. It sort of by accident took on that aspect. So as I understand it, Sontag kind of sees camp as a way of looking at the world. It's been years since I read Sontag's essay, but I'm not going to focus on that now. I'm focusing on J. Bryan Lowder's response to Susan Sontag. And as I was reading this is also just a great illustration of the nastiness of the political left. And let's just read and you'll see what I'm talking about. I once went on a date with a man who did not appreciate camp. He preferred sensibility that was a nervous, punk-inflected disaffection, and I found it exotic, frustrating, and somewhat arousing. You don't need to tell that, J. Bryan Lowder. This is a arts, entertainment, and more section. Tell us about the arts, entertainment, and more. You do not need to know what I find arousing in my wife, all right? When I began to gather over my second glass of Riesling that he did not much identify with the gay stuff that heavily defined my life, I asked him bluntly, "Are you, into camp?" He informed me that camp had sometime in the 1980s or 90s morphed into hipster irony and had been washed out by its diffusion into the general culture. New York was over too. He would move to Canada soon. So pretty much J. Bryan Lowder's Louder with Crowder, but the boyfriend preferred sort of a more punk rock style and thought that camp humor had become hipster cutesiness. You know, you see this in meme culture. You see this everywhere. Everything is cutesy. Everything is fey. Nothing is that serious. I had heard this sigh of an argument before, of course. This sigh of an argument. So J. Bryan Lowder is now kind of condescending to the intelligence of his former gay lover. What a relationship that must have been. But it struck me as particularly disappointing coming from one ostensibly of my tribe. Boy, how do I join the big gay tribe? Do you guys like dance around the fire and beat drums or something? Do you all have like big gay worship songs to some big gay god? What the hell? Open tribalism? Oh my gosh. This is so condescending. J. Bryan Lowder has decided on behalf of gay people that you guys are all part of a tribe that I don't get to be in, I guess, because I'm straight. Someone who by right of birth should get camp. So J. Bryan Lowder is literally saying that as a matter of how his gay lover was born, he's supposed to understand certain things about camp culture. So for J. Bryan Lowder, talking about camp, when people who are sane talk about camp in like Batman, the Adam West show, we're talking about just something humorous, right? But in this planet, camp humor has taken on a political, cultural dimension to it that is actually purely definitional to being gay. There's something, if you're gay and you don't get camp, there's something wrong with you. You've abandoned your big gay birthright, according to J. Bryan Lowder. In retrospect, though, I realized that my sadness was misplaced. We weren't really talking about camp at all. We were talking about campy. And pretty much the rest of his argument is about trying to flesh out this so subtle a distinction. I don't know if it needs to be made, but in Lowder's view, camp is a way of looking at the world. Camp B is a bit more affected, and then he blasts Susan Sontag's essay, Notes on Camp. his way of describing her is so concerning to me. He calls her like part of a larger cultural epidemic. Susan Sontag's essay have infected your mind. It's such dark language to describe something. He's not saying, I disagree with Susan Sontag, here are my points in counter to her. It's like he sees Susan Sontag as some sort of Voldemort who has infected the planet with a mind virus. And it's just illustrative of how this kind of culture talks about things. It's never, oh, here's what I think is good art. It's, here's what's wrong with everybody. Here's what's wrong with suburban America and their plebeian little capitalist lives. And even though Sontag's a leftist, Lauder's happy to describe her in the same sort of hi ambulance, go save that person. But there's no peace in the left. There's no friendliness in the left. It's always, you're a problem. You're infecting people. Let's get past some of this, though. So then Lauder goes on to talk about the 1958 movie Anti-Mame, and he kind of uses it as an illustration of what camp is and how sort of over-the-top and silly and affected and anachronistic that movie is. It's pleasurable and fast-paced, and it's a blast to watch, but it's also kind of silly. And as we get down here, he highlights ideas like Mame saying "darling" and "adorable little bootlegger." So do you hear it already? What's difficult about a camp sense of humor is you're saying something, but your intention says something different. So you're not just saying may the force be with you. You're like saying, may the force be with you. And that's how you're communicating that you're not being entirely serious as you're quoting it. Now, in Lauder's view, campiness is more about affecting knowledge. So you're with your friends in college, and you start quoting Anti-Mame as a part of hipster irony, a half-hearted apologia for that knowledge. We want people to know that we know what we know is maybe not authentically cool enough to know, even as we can't help but let them know that we know it. And lodged somewhere within all of this tortured choreography, I'm told, is fun. So now what he's describing is the person who is being campy. They are quoting something as a way of illustrating that they're smart, but they're kind of embarrassed that they know about it. My Little Pony, right? When there's an element of camp to My Little Pony, where if you talk about it and admit you know about My Little Pony, you're maybe a little bit embarrassed about it, but you're having fun as you do it. You know, like Rarity is Best Pony versus Pinkie Pie is Best Pony, that kind of thing. Ironically, I think that Lauder's being a little bit campy here as he describes it. So when he writes, it's not authentically cool enough to know, even as we can't help but let you know that we know it. He himself is sort of granting that this is a little bit of a silly thing he's talking about. He's kind of humble bragging about how smart he is to know about it, and using sort of a comedic bit of irony to ameliorate the blow a bit. So I actually kind of admire that as a bit of writing, that he uses that kind of gag while discussing that kind of gag, and then he closes by saying he's going to come back next week to tell you what camp is as opposed to campiness. Boy, get it all down into one point, Lauder. I know you have a very condescending view of gay people, and I know you have a very nasty view of Susan Sontag, but at least you could try to make your two-part distinction in one blog post. But pretty much the sum of this is camp is some sort of great, powerful thing within the history of queer culture, and campy is a little bit more hipster irony. I'm not really being serious about all this kind of a vibe. But more important to me than this distinction is how important camp is to LGBT, arts, entertainment, and more. What did this essay tell you about art, really? Well, maybe it would help you think about what hipster irony is, but why would this be important for us to think about in terms of arts and culture? Well, the reason it's viewed as important to think about in terms of arts and culture is that camp is viewed as the sort of queer artistic contribution to world history, and it's a way of I think undermining the seriousness of the older world and the older culture. So if the old culture has a lot of seriousness and stolidity and beauty and stoicism to it, then camp culture becomes a way of, like, I don't know, wrapping the American flag around Batman's butt or something and saying, tee-hee, that we don't have to take that too seriously. And the thing is, anyone can love camp. No one has a monopoly on art, appreciation for art, or appreciation for silly humor, or appreciation for these things. But I think that in the minds of kind of queer theory art theorists, they want a monopoly on this so that they can begin to have more cultural influence and sort of claim cultural power. I see Lauder's essay as the illustration of what most concerns me about the new art criticism and discussion world that is started in the universities and has trickled into Slate and all of these fake news sites, is this attitude that we are smart, we're going to educate you plebeians about the state of the world, and we live a more fulfilling life than you. Here we go. Here's the point I wanted to make. So if camp is a way of looking at the world and sort of seeing aesthetic joy and exuberance in everything, queer theory professors on campus do not have a monopoly on that way of looking at the world. Almost anyone can walk through the world, you know, full of joy, looking for beauty in everything, being enthusiastic about things. You hear me be enthusiastic about things. I think it's one of the reasons that I love camp. But that kind of appreciation of life far precedes queer theory classes on American university campuses. But if you're stuck in the middle of a queer theory class, what you will be presented with is this idea that you have an intellectually enriched life, and the poor idiot red state voters, they all have a meager life of intellectual unfulfillment. They are slaves of the capitalist system. They're slaves of the suburban family lifestyle. They live unfulfilling lives. They're so pitiable. They're so unhappy. And I think this is what creates the gap between our cultures. Except that it's a gap that's created entirely by the left isolating itself and seeing itself as intellectually superior to the right, or you don't have to identify yourself with the right for the left to identify you with the right. And if you live an average sort of life in the suburbs, that's enough for you to qualify as living this sort of unironic, kitsch, campy culture that they sort of see, they sort of look down upon as, we are so intelligent, we understand the nature of camp and kitsch. Anyway, so I think what I learned from Our Boy Diversity in Comics and seeing Audrey Sitterson use this kind of humor as a way of undermining the Joes, making the Joes look silly and kind of, oh, tee-hee, everything's meaningless, nothing matters. Now that there we go. Diversity in Comics gives me language to describe everything. Tee-hee, nothing matters. That kind of humor in Marvel Comics and DC Comics. What I've connected with is that tee-hee, nothing matters has a root in not just camp humor, but politicized camp humor. So even though that was like my absolute least favorite part of SJW art school, even less than feminist art theory, because I didn't understand what the heck the queer theory was supposed to be talking about, I think it's about time for me to revisit some of that too and add that as a dimension to my research. And hopefully what I'm hoping to do is try to trace a line from this sort of pseudo-intellectual discussion of camp down into our G.I. Joe comics. Anyway, I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later. I also want to thank my 2 new patrons on Patreon. Troy Reiser is a fine artist and a longtime thoughtful person in the community discussing topics related to art history and art technique. You can find his art portfolio on troyreiser.com. I also want to thank LT Fish. I have liked every comic that the Lieutenant has recommended to me, and he's got a great YouTube channel with a series called Fish Likes Flicks, where he also talks about very interesting and unique movies from around the world. So I think you'll dig it. Thoughtful commentary on movies and comics. All links are in the description below.